Nobody at the Holland Creek sale barn thought she was serious when Marisol Quintero climbed the pipe rail of the back pen and started pointing at the culls. The auctioneer had already run the good stock through, the fat weaned steers with their glossy coats and their broad hindquarters, and the buyers with their hats pushed back had bought what they came for and drifted toward the coffee urn. What was left in the back pen was the leavings. 40 head of scrubby, mismatched calves that had been separated out because nobody wanted the trouble of them. They were the runts and the late-borns, and the ones with legs a little crooked or coats a little dull, the ones whose mothers had gone dry early or died on the calving ground, the orphans that had been bottle-raised half-heartedly and never quite caught up. And there she was, a girl not yet 23, in a canvas coat 2 sizes too big that had belonged to a dead man, pointing at them one by one and telling the yard hand she wanted the whole lot. The men by the coffee urn turned to watch. Somebody laughed, not unkindly, the way you laugh at a child who has decided to buy the ugliest puppy. Del Rasmussen, who ran 400 head on the flats below the Kettleback Road and considered himself the man whose opinion mattered most in that county, set down his cup and said loud enough to carry, "That girl's going to pay money to feed something that will never pay her back." And that was the sentence that hung over the whole thing for the next 3 years, the sentence the county repeated at the feed store and the gas pump and the church potluck, the sentence that reality itself would spend the better part of a decade quietly taken apart. If you have ever been handed the weakest, sorriest version of a thing and told plainly to your face that it would come to nothing, do me a small favor before we go on. Tap the like button so this story reaches somebody else who needs to hear how it ends, and leave a comment telling me the town you are watching from, because I read them and I like knowing where these stories land. Now let me take you back to the pen and the girl and the 40 calves nobody wanted. She did not answer Del Rasmussen. That was the first thing people noticed about Marisol, that she let a thing sit rather than argue it. She finished her count. She wrote the number in a small water-stained notebook she kept in her breast pocket. And she paid what the culls were worth, which was almost nothing. Hardly more than the price of the diesel to haul them home. The yard hand asked her twice if she was sure, and both times she said only, "I am sure," and signed the ticket. Then she backed the borrowed stock trailer to the loading chute herself, because there was no one to do it for her, and she loaded 40 weak calves onto a trailer meant for 20, and she drove them up the washboard grade of the Kettleback Road to the place that had come to her by way of death rather than plan. The place was called Ember Hollow by the old people, though the name had fallen off the maps years back. It sat where the county road gave out against the foot of the Sabinaw Hills, 400 acres of thin pasture and cedar breaks, and one crooked creek that ran hard in April and disappeared in August. Her grandfather, Austin Quintero, had run it for 50 years, and had run it into the ground by the end, not from carelessness, but from age, from the slow winnowing that takes a man's hands and knees before it takes his stubbornness. When he died in the late winter, he left it to Marisol, his daughter's daughter, because there was no one else. Her mother had gone to the city long ago and stayed there. Her father was a name and a photograph. She had spent her summers at Ember Hollow as a child, following her grandfather through the cedar with a bucket, and she had come back now not because she had a plan, but because she had nowhere else that felt like it belonged to her, and because a place with your dead grandfather's boots still by the door has a way of asking you to stay. She had not come back to run cattle. That was the thing the county could never square. She had come back to sit in the quiet and figure out what she wanted. And she had walked the 400 acres for 3 weeks in the raw end of winter, and somewhere in that walk-in the ground had spoken to her the way it had once spoken to Austin, and she had decided without deciding that she would try. She had a little money, not much, the small remainder of what her grandfather had left after the funeral and the taxes. She had his tools and his fences half fallen, and his knowledge written in a hand she could barely read across the margins of a dozen ruled notebooks stacked in a kitchen drawer. and she had the memory of a single thing her great-aunt Ludivine had said to her the week after the funeral, standing in the yard with her arms folded, a thing that would take Marisol 2 years to fully understand. Ludivine Quintero was 91 years old and had outlived 2 husbands and 1 son, and she lived in a small house at the low end of the property that Austin had built for her when she was widowed the second time. She moved slowly and spoke rarely, and wore men's work trousers and a wool vest without the least self-consciousness, because she had earned the right to wear whatever kept her warm and did not care what the county thought of an old woman in trousers. She had watched Marisol come back and had said nothing about it for 2 weeks, which in Ludivine was a form of approval. Then, on the day Marisol told her she was thinking of buying some cattle to work the ground, Ludivine had looked at her a long moment and said, "Your grandfather always said the poorest calf on the poorest grass makes the best beef. If you have the patience God did not give most men." And then she had gone inside and shut the door, and that was the entire conversation. And Marisol had turned the sentence over in her mind for a long time without knowing what to do with it. She knew what the county did with calves. You bought the biggest, healthiest weaners you could afford, you poured feed into them, you pushed them fast to wait on grain and supplement, and you sold them into the commodity chain at 18 months, where they became numbers on a scale, indistinguishable, worth exactly the market price on the day, and not a cent more. Del Rasmussen did it that way, and did it well, and had the truck and the barn and the banknote to prove it. Everybody did it that way. It was the only way anyone in that county knew, the way of scale and speed and debt, the way where the animal was a machine for turning corn into pounds as fast as possible. And Marisol, walking her grandfather's thin pastures with his crooked creek and his cedar brakes that no grain-pushing operation would ever bother with, had begun to wonder whether her grandfather had meant something else entirely. The 40 calves came off the trailer that first evening, bawling and stumbling, ribs showing, one of them so bandy-legged it walked like a sailor, another with a torn ear that had healed wrong, several of them the small dun and brindle mongrel colors that no self-respecting seed-stock man would let near his herd. She turned them into the home pasture and stood at the gate a long time in the failing light, not moving, just looking at them the way she looked at everything, the way that made people think she was slow until they understood she was only careful. She was counting, but not counting heads. She was counting the things the sale barn had counted against them, and asking herself whether every one of those things was truly a fault, or only a fault under one particular way of doing business. The bandy legs would straighten with good ground and time. The torn ear meant nothing to a cut of beef. The dun and brindle blood was old blood, hardy blood, the blood of animals bred to survive on hills like these before anyone decided cattle should be uniform and pale and fat. She wrote in her notebook that night by lamplight because the wiring in the old house was bad, a single line, not weak, just judged by the wrong scale. She spent that whole first spring simply keeping them alive and learning them, and it was harder than she let anyone see. 2 of the smallest calves scoured and nearly died, and she sat up 3 nights with them in the shed, mixing electrolytes by feel and warming milk on the propane ring, and she saved one and lost the other, and she buried the one she lost at the top of the home pasture and did not tell anyone. She learned that the bandy-legged one, whom she never named because she did not name any of them, was in fact the smartest animal in the bunch, the first to find water and the first to figure out a gate, and she began to watch him the way you watch a person who knows something you do not. She read her grandfather's notebooks by lamplight until her eyes ached, deciphering his cramped hand, and slowly a picture came together out of the scattered notes, a picture of how Austin had run the place in his best years, before age forced him onto the easy grain road like everyone else. He had rotated his cattle. He had moved them across the ground in tight bunches and given each pasture long rest, mimicking, though he never used the word, the way the wild herds had once moved across those hills, grazing hard and moving on and not returning until the grass had fully recovered. The land, worked that way, had fed itself, The cattle, raised that way, had grown slow and lean, and her grandfather noted in the margin of one page in a sentence Marisol read a dozen times, tasted like something. Tasted like something. She did not know yet what that would come to mean, but she began to move her 40 calves the way the notebooks described, on foot, with a single dog she inherited half-trained and finished herself. A lean black and tan named Sorrel, who took to the work as though she had been waiting her whole life to be asked. Every day or two Marisol shifted the little herd to fresh ground and let the grazed ground rest, and she built temporary fence out of step-in posts and a single wire and a solar charger the size of a lunchbox. And she moved that fence with her own hands in all weathers, and the county, when it heard about it, laughed a second time. Del Rasmussen told the men at the Threlkeld Feed and Seed that the Quintero girl was out there herding $40 calves around by hand like it was 1880, and that she would work herself to death for beasts that would never make weight, and that it just went to show what happened when a place passed to somebody with no idea what they were doing. And the men laughed, and the story spread, and Marisol, who heard about all of it eventually because nothing stays secret in a county that small, wrote in her notebook, "Let them," and kept moving her fence. The first full year passed the way that kind of year passes, in a long grind of small labors that no one sees, and that add up to something only in retrospect. She patched the corrals and rehung the gates that her grandfather had let sag. She cleared cedar out of the good draws, dragging the cut trees into brush piles that became rabbit warrens and then fox dens, and the cleared ground came back thick in native grass she could not name until Ludovine, walking the fence line with her one still afternoon, bent down and touched a seed head and said, "Side oats, and little blue stem there. Your grandfather seeded that draw the year before you were born, and it went to cedar when he got old, and now look." It was the longest string of words Ludovine had offered in months, and Marisol understood it as the praise it was, and she did not make a production of it, only nodded and kept walking, the way the old woman had taught her without ever teaching her anything. The calves, meanwhile, changed. Slowly, so slowly that Marisol did not fully see it until she compared them against the memory of what had come off the trailer. They filled out. Not fat, never fat, but deep-bodied and hard-muscled and bright-eyed, their coats gone slick and their crooked legs come straight on the good ground, and they moved across the hills like animals that belonged there, which they did, because their old mongrel blood had been made for exactly this. By the second spring she had 38 head, having lost the one calf that first year, and one yearling to a lightning strike she could do nothing about, and she had her first animals ready to finish. And here she made the decision that the county would never have made, and could never afterward forgive itself for not making, because it was the decision that Austin's notebooks and Ludovine's single sentence had been pointing at all along. She did not haul them to the sale barn to disappear into the commodity chain at the market price on the day. She kept them on the grass until they were slow grown and finished the way beef had been finished before feedlots existed, and then she had the first two processed at the little state-inspected locker over in Harnaby, 40 miles down the valley, and she brought home boxes of vacuum-sealed cuts with her grandfather's brand stamped on a paper label she had drawn herself, and she began quietly, without a website or a sign or a single dollar of advertising, to sell beef. The first sale was to Ludovine, who paid full price and would not be argued out of it, and who cooked a single steak that night in a cast-iron pan with nothing but salt, and who ate it slowly at her kitchen table with Marisol watching, and who set down her fork when she was done and looked out the window at the dark hills for a while and then said, "That is what beef tasted like when I was a girl, and I did not think I would taste it again before I died." She did not say it with any drama. She said it the way she said everything, flatly, as a fact offered for consideration. But Marisol saw the old woman's hand tremble slightly as she pushed the plate away, and she understood that she had made something that was more than food, that she had reached back across 70 years and handed an old woman a piece of her own childhood. And she went home that night and wrote in her notebook, "This is the thing," and underlined it twice, though she could not yet have told you exactly what she meant by the thing. The second sale was harder, because the second sale was to a stranger. There was a woman named Bettine Osgood who ran the diner attached to the gas station where the Kettleback Road met the state highway, a place called the Wandering Hen that fed every trucker and farmer and traveling salesman who passed through that stretch of the valley. And Bettine was the true center of the county, the hub through which every piece of news and gossip and reputation flowed, because everyone stopped at the Hen eventually, and everyone talked to Bettine. Marisol brought her 4 packages of ground beef and 2 steaks, and asked her plainly to try them, and to charge her nothing and owe her nothing, and to tell her the truth. Bettine, who had heard all the stories about the crazy Quintero girl and her worthless calves, took the meat mostly out of pity and cooked a burger off the ground beef for her own lunch the next day, not expecting anything. And she told the story later so many times that it became a kind of county scripture. She said she took 1 bite standing at the flat top with the spatula still in her hand, and she stopped chewing and stood there. And old Maris Caldbeck, who was drinking coffee at the counter, asked her what was wrong, and she said nothing was wrong, and she finished the burger without sitting down, and then she picked up the phone and called Marisol Quintero and asked how much beef she had and how fast she could get more. That was the turning, though nobody knew it was the turning, least of all Marisol, who was still moving her fence by hand every day and sitting up nights with sick animals and reading her dead grandfather's notebooks until her eyes gave out. Bettine put the Ember Hollow beef on the menu at the Wandering Hen with no fanfare, just a small hand-lettered card that said local grass beef, and she charged $2 more for the burger, and nobody complained because after the first bite nobody could go back. And the truckers who ate at the Hen carried the story down the valley in both directions, and the farmers who ate at the Hen went home and told their wives, and the traveling salesmen who ate at the Hen mentioned it at their next stop, and word of the beef from the girl on the Kettleback Road moved outward the way word moves in country places, from mouth to mouth, slowly, but with a weight that no billboard ever carries, because it came from people who had no reason to lie and everything to gain from being the one who knew about it first. Del Rasmussen heard about it too, of course, and Del Rasmussen was not ready to believe it. He came into the Threlkeld Feed and Seed on a cold morning in the 3rd winter and stood among the men by the stove. And when the subject came around to the Quintero beef, as it did more and more often now, Del said the thing that would follow him for the rest of his life. He said, sure, she sold a few burgers to Bettine and the tourists, but that is a hobby, not a business, and a hobby leads to nothing. And mark my words, that ground cannot carry a real herd and never could. And in 2 years, she will be selling out and moving to the city like her mother did, because thin grass and mongrel cattle and doing everything the hard way by hand leads exactly nowhere. He said it with the certainty of a man who had 400 head and a banknote and 40 years of doing it the only right way. And the men around the stove nodded, because it was the conventional wisdom, and the conventional wisdom had never failed them before. And it did not occur to any of them that the conventional wisdom might simply be the sound a whole county makes when it has forgotten how to see. But reality had already begun the slow work of taking Del's sentence apart, one order at a time, because the thing about beef that tastes like something, in a world that had forgotten what beef was supposed to taste like, is that the people who taste it do not forget, and they do not go quietly, and they tell other people, and those people drive out of their way and pay more and wait longer to get it. By the 3rd spring, Marisol had a waiting list, not a mailing list, not a marketing funnel, just a list of names and phone numbers in the back of her water-stained notebook, families and a few restaurants down the valley who wanted a quarter or a half or a whole animal and were willing to wait months for it, because she would not push her cattle faster than the grass could grow them, and she would not run more animals than her ground could carry the slow way. And so there was only ever so much beef, and the scarcity was not a strategy but a consequence of doing it right, and the scarcity made the thing more wanted, not less. She raised her prices, not to be greedy, but because Ludovine told her flatly one evening that she was charging less than the beef was worth, and that underpricing a good thing was its own kind of lie. And even after she raised them, the list only grew. She hired her first help that spring, a lanky 16-year-old named Cabot Frayne, whose family farmed a hardscrabble 80 just down the road, and who had been hanging around the Ember Hollow fences on his bicycle for a year, watching her move cattle, asking questions no one else thought to ask. He was quiet like she was and patient like she was, and he took to the rotational work as though it were a language he had always known, and she paid him fairly and taught him everything her grandfather's notebooks had taught her. And Cabot became the first person besides Ludovine who understood what she was doing and why, and the first person who believed it would work. Not because he trusted her, but because he had seen the grass come back with his own eyes. Together they built more temporary fence and pushed the grazing across ground that had gone to cedar and brush for a decade, and the ground responded the way the notebooks promised it would, the native grasses thickening, the thin soil deepening, the crooked creek running a little longer into the summer each year because the healed ground held the water instead of shedding it, and the little herd grew, all of it out of its own increase, every new animal born on the place and raised on the grass, not one head bought on credit, not $1 borrowed from any bank. That was the part the county could not understand, and the part that Ludovine understood better than anyone. Marisol refused to grow the way growth was supposed to happen. She would not take out a loan to buy more land or more cattle or a bigger truck. She would not build the herd faster than the ground could feed it. She would not sell into the commodity chain even in the lean stretches when the cash would have helped, because the moment she did that, she would be just another number maker, and the thing that made her beef worth waiting for would be gone. She let the demand pull the growth, slowly, animal by animal, season by season, the way a well fills from below rather than from a pipe. And when people told her she was leaving money on the table by not scaling up, she gave them the flat, confident answer that became her signature. The thing she said to everyone from feed salesman to a food writer who eventually drove 3 hours out from the city to find her. She said, "I am not in a hurry, and the grass is not in a hurry, and the cattle are not in a hurry, and the only ones in a hurry are the ones who want to be paid before the work is done." And then she would go back to moving her fence. The food writer's article, when it came, changed the scale of things without changing the thing itself. The woman had eaten a steak at a small restaurant down in the state capital that had begun buying whole animals from Ember Hollow, and she had asked the chef where it came from, and the chef had told her about the girl on the Kettleback Road who raised mongrel cattle on healed grass and moved her fence by hand, and the writer had driven out and spent 2 days walking the pastures with Marisol and Cabot and sitting at Ludovine's kitchen table. And the piece she wrote was not a hype piece, because Marisol would not give her hype, but a quiet and careful account of a young woman doing an old thing exactly right in a country that had forgotten it. It ran in a magazine that people in cities read, and after it ran, the phone at the old house rang so often that Marisol had to take it off the hook to get any work done. And the waiting list grew from a page to a book, and there were offers, so many offers, to invest, to expand, to franchise the name, to put Ember Hollow beef in stores in 3 states, and every single one of them wanted the same thing, which was more, faster, bigger, now. She said no to all of them, and she said it the same way each time without heat, as a simple fact of who she was and what the ground could bear. She told one investor, a pleasant man in an expensive vest who had flown in and rented a car and driven out to make her rich, that the whole reason his clients wanted her beef was that she did not do what he was asking her to do, and that the day she did it, his clients would no longer want the beef, because it would be the same as everything else, and that she was not interested in destroying the one thing she had built in order to sell more of a thing that would no longer be worth buying. The man did not understand her. Men like him never did. He drove back to the airport thinking she was a fool who did not understand her own success, and he was exactly as wrong as Dell Rasmussen had been at the sale barn 4 years before, and for exactly the same reason, which was that he was measuring her by a scale that had nothing to do with what she was actually doing. The turning of Dell Rasmussen came in the 5th year, in the deep part of a hard drought that broke a good many of the men who ran cattle the fast way on the flats below the Kettleback Road. The rain simply did not come that spring, and the grain-fed operations that had scraped their ground bare found themselves with nothing under their cattle and feed prices climbing past what they could pay. And Dell, who had leveraged himself to expand 2 years running, because that was what the conventional wisdom said a man should do, found himself in the worst season of his life, hauling water and selling breeding stock at a loss, and watching his overgrazed pastures turn to dust. And up the grade at Ember Hollow, on the thin ground everyone had said could not carry a real herd, the healed grass held. It held because the deep-rooted native grasses Marisol had nursed back over 5 years reached down to moisture the shallow-rooted planted stuff could not, and it held because the soil, rebuilt slowly by the tight then-rested grazing, drank the little rain that did fall instead of shedding it down the crooked creek, and the Ember Hollow cattle came through that drought lean but sound, while the county's fat cattle foundered. Dell Rasmussen, driving up the Kettleback Road one evening on his way to look at a piece of ground he was being forced to sell, stopped his truck at the Ember Hollow fence line and sat there a long time looking at the green draw and the sleek dun cattle grazing in the failing light, and he did not say anything to anyone because there was no one there to say it to. He came back a week later and knocked on the door of the old house. Marisol answered in her grandfather's coat with the notebook in the breast pocket, and Dell stood on the step turning his hat in his hands, a big proud man made small by a season he had not seen coming, and he did not make a large production of it. He said only that he had been wrong about the grass, and wrong about the cattle, and wrong about her, and that he had come to ask whether she would show him how she had done it, because he was going to lose half his ground if he kept on the way he was going and he had no one left to ask. And Marisol, who could have said any number of things about the sale barn and the feed store and the sentence that had followed her for 4 years, said none of them. She looked at him for a long beat the way she looked at everything, and then she stepped back and held the door and said, "Come in. My great-aunt made coffee," and she poured him a cup at the same table where Ludovine had eaten the first steak, and she got out her grandfather's notebooks and began, patiently, to explain. She spent that whole hard summer helping Dell Rasmussen learn to see his own ground, and she never charged him a cent, and she never mentioned that he had once told a barn full of men that she would work herself to death for beasts that would never pay her back. She taught him to move his cattle in tight bunches and rest his pastures, and she gave him seed from her own healed draws and showed Cabot how to help him build temporary fence. And slowly, over 2 seasons, Dell's overgrazed flats began the same long recovery that Ember Hollow had made, and Dell became, of all things, her strongest advocate at the Threlkeld feed and seed, a converted man testifying among the unconverted, which is the most powerful witness there is. He would tell the men by the stove, "That girl saved my ground, and I laughed at her for 4 years," and the men who had laughed with him fell quiet and began, one at a time, to drive up the Kettleback Road and knock on the door of the old house, and Marisol taught every one of them who asked, because Ludovine had told her that knowledge hoarded goes to cedar the same as ground does, and that the only knowledge worth having is the kind you give away. Ludovine died in the autumn of the 6th year, in her own bed in the small house at the low end of the property, 97 years old, having lived to see the thing she had pointed toward with a single sentence 6 years before come fully true. She had watched the mongrel calves nobody wanted become a herd that anchored a county's understanding of what was possible, and she had eaten Ember Hollow beef every Sunday of those 6 years, and had never once made a ceremony of it, and near the end, when Marisol sat with her in the long evenings, The old woman had begun to talk more than she ever had in her life, telling stories of Austin as a young man, and of the hills before the cedar came, and of the beef that tasted like something in the years before the world forgot. On the last clear evening, a few days before she went, she took Marisol's hand in her own thin, cold one and said, "Your grandfather knew, and I knew, and nobody would listen to us because we were old and we were poor, and we did things the slow way, and I lived long enough to watch you make them listen without ever raising your voice, and that is the finest thing I have seen." And then she was quiet, and after a while she said the sentence one last time, "The poorest calf on the poorest grass makes the best beef if you have the patience God did not give most men." And she smiled a little, and that was the last long thing she said. They buried her at the top of the home pasture, next to Austin, next to the unmarked spot where Marisol had buried the calf she lost that first hard spring, in ground that had gone from cedar and dust to deep native grass in the years the old woman had watched over it. And half the county came up the Kettleback Road for the burial, including Del Rasmussen, who stood at the back with his hat off and his head down, and Bettine Osgood, who closed the Wandering Hen for the only time in 30 years, and Cabot Frayne, grown now into a steady young man who ran half the operation and would run more of it in the years to come. Marisol did not give a speech. She was not a woman who gave speeches. She stood at the head of the grave in her grandfather's coat with the notebook in the pocket, and she looked at the 2 headstones and the grass and the sleek cattle grazing on the far slope in the autumn light, and she let the silence say the thing she could not, and everyone standing there understood it anyway, because by then the whole county had learned to read her silences the way you learn to read weather. The expansion, when it finally came the same way everything at Ember Hollow came, which was slowly and out of its own increase and without a single dollar of debt. In the 7th year, the ground next to Ember Hollow came up for sale, 300 acres that had been run into the dust by a grain operation that finally gave up, and Marisol bought it outright with money she had saved by never being in a hurry. And she did not stock it with cattle the first year or the second. She simply began to heal it the way she had healed her grandfather's ground, moving a small bunch across it in tight rotation and letting it rest, watching the native grass come back out of the seed bank that had waited in the soil all those years for someone patient enough to call it up. She added animals only as the healed ground could carry them, and she trained more young people the way she had trained Cabot, and she supplied more restaurants down the valley and in the capital, and she never once ran an advertisement or built a brand in the way the men in expensive vests had wanted her to, because the demand pulled the growth all on its own, the same way it always had, from mouth to mouth, from one person who had tasted the thing to another who had not yet. And the brand, such as it was, remained her grandfather's brand, and the paper label she had drawn herself that first spring by lamplight, the crude little sketch of the Sabinaw Hills with a single crooked creek running through them, the mark that now meant, to people 3 states away who had never set foot in that county, a specific and irreplaceable thing that could not be scaled or franchised or hurried, because it was made of patience and healed ground and slow-grown cattle and the accumulated knowledge of dead people who had done things the right way when no one was watching and had been proven right long after they could enjoy it. Marisol kept the same notebook in the same breast pocket of the same dead man's coat, replacing the coat's worn elbows with patches rather than replacing the coat, and the notebook filled and was set on the shelf next to Austin's dozen notebooks and Ludovine's few, a lengthening record of a family that had learned to see worth where the world saw waste. And she started a new notebook, and on the first page of the new one she wrote the sentence her great-aunt had said to her the week after the first funeral, the sentence about the poorest calf on the poorest grass, so that whoever came after her, Cabot or one of the young ones she was training or a child she might one day have, would find it there and understand where the whole thing had started. There is a photograph that hangs now in the Wandering Hen, behind the counter where Bettine still works the flat top, though her hair is gone entirely white. A photograph a customer took years back and had framed and gave to her of Marisol Quintero standing at the Ember Hollow fence line in the evening light in her grandfather's coat, looking out at the cattle on the heeled slope, not doing anything, just looking, the way she has always looked at things, carefully, patiently, seeing what is there rather than what she has been told is there. And underneath the photograph someone has written, in Bettine's own hand, the words she heard Marisol say once and never forgot: "I am not in a hurry, and the grass is not in a hurry." And truckers who stop at the hen still ask about it, and Bettine still tells the story, the whole story. From the back pen at the Holland Creek sale barn, where a girl not yet 23 bought 40 calves nobody wanted while a room full of men who knew better laughed at her, all the way to the 2 graves at the top of the home pasture and the herd that grazes past them in the changing light, and the young people who came up the Kettleback Road to learn the slow way from the woman who proved that the slow way was the only way that ever truly lasted. Del Rasmussen is an old man now, and he runs his ground the way Marisol taught him, and his grandchildren will inherit healed pastures instead of dust, and he says, to anyone who will listen, that the smartest thing he ever did was knock on that door and admit he was wrong. And the dumbest thing he ever did was open his mouth at the sale barn all those years before. He tells the young ones who are just starting out, do not measure a thing by the only scale you know, because the only scale you know might be the wrong scale entirely, and there might be a girl in a dead man's coat who can see a value you have been trained your whole life not to see. And sometimes, on a clear evening, he drives up the Kettleback Road and stops his truck at the Ember Hollow fence line, the same place he stopped it in the drought year when the green draw first made him understand, and he sits there a while and looks at the cattle and the grass and the 2 headstones on the hill, and he thinks about how a whole county was so certain, and how certainty is the cheapest thing in the world, and how the only things that ever proved out were the slow things nobody had the patience to wait for. If this story reached you today, and if you have ever been handed the weakest, smallest, most dismissed version of a thing and told to your face that it would never amount to anything, do something for me before you go. Share this with the person in your life who has been told that what they have or who they are is not worth much, because they may need to hear tonight that reality has a long memory and a patient way of proving the doubters wrong. Leave me a comment about a time you saw worth in something everyone else had written off, or a time someone saw it in you, because those are the stories I most want to read. Tell me the town you are watching from so I know where in the world this landed tonight. And know that I read every single comment, every one, the same way Marisol read her grandfather's notebooks by lamplight, slowly and with attention, looking for the thing that everyone else walked right past. The winters at Ember Hollow are the thing outsiders never think to ask about, but they are where the truth of the place lives. Marisol came to love them, the way you come to love a hard companion who never lies to you. In the deep cold, the herd drew close in the cedar breaks she had once cleared and then let grow back in careful patches, using them now as living windbreaks, the way Austin's notebooks had described in a margin she had almost missed. She fed no grain even then. She had built the operation so that the healed grass, stockpiled through the growing season and left standing, carried the cattle through the snow. And on the coldest mornings she would walk out with Cabot, older now and steadier, and they would move the bunch onto fresh stockpile and stand a moment watching the animals graze down through the frost to the cured grass beneath, their breath rising in the flat white light, and neither of them would say anything, because there was nothing that needed saying. She married late and quietly, a man named Theodore Halloran, who came out one autumn to buy a quarter of beef and stayed for the coffee and kept finding reasons to drive back up the Kettleback Road, and who understood, the way almost no one understood, that she was not in a hurry about that either. He was a carpenter by trade, and he fixed the old house properly at last rewired it so she could read at night without straining, and he built shelves in the front room where the notebooks stood in a long, unbroken row, Austin's and Ludovine's and Marisol's, the whole accumulated patience of a family in cramped ink. They had a daughter and named her Ludovine, and the child grew up on the healed ground the way Marisol had grown up in summers, following her mother through the cedar with a bucket, learning without being taught, watching the way her mother looked at things before she touched them. The girl was 6 the first time she asked why they did not just buy more cattle and sell more beef like the man in the vest had wanted, because even a child could see the money that was being left on the table. And Marisol set down the fence reel she was carrying and looked at her daughter a long beat, the old careful look, and then she crouched to the child's height and said the thing plainly. She said, "The reason people come from far away to want what we make is that we do not make very much of it, and we do not make it fast, and we do not make it the way everyone else makes theirs. And the day we do all that, we will have nothing anyone wants." She said, "Patience is not the thing we do while we wait for the real work. Patience is the work." And the child did not fully understand it, the way Marisol had not fully understood her great-aunt's sentence for 2 years. But she carried it, and it settled into her the way the rain settled into the healed ground, slowly, held rather than shed. On a clear evening near the end of her own life, Marisol Quintero stood at the same fence line where the photograph in the Wandering Hen had caught her decades before, in the same coat, patched now beyond counting, the notebook still in the breast pocket, though the hand that wrote in it had gone slow. Her grown daughter stood beside her, and beyond them on the slope, the cattle grazed past 4 headstones now instead of 2, and the crooked creek ran silver in the low light, running later into the summer with every passing year. She did not say anything for a long while. She only looked, the way she had always looked, seeing what was there. Then she said quietly to her daughter and to the hills, and to whoever might one day stand where she stood, they laughed, and reality did not, and reality is the only judge that ever counted.